The old creak of the wooden floors echoed through the house as Carl shuffled into the living room, the fading sunlight filtering through the dusty window panes. He paused, taking in the familiar sight, a well-worn armchair, the framed photographs lining the walls, and the scent of aged wood mingling with the faint aroma of old books. This was home, and it was here that he felt the remnants of his past wrap around him like a cozy blanket. "Carl, dear," came the gentle voice of his mother, Agnes, from the kitchen. "Would you like tea or coffee?" "Tea will do, Mom," Carl replied, his voice steady, though it carried an undercurrent of weariness. He took a moment to gaze out the window at the sprawling garden his parents had nurtured over the years. Even in its simplicity, it flourished, a testament to their dedication. As he waited, Carl's mind drifted back to his years in the army. Fierce battles and camaraderie with comrades flashed before his eyes. It had been a life of discipline and duty, but now, retired and standing on the edge of a new chapter, he sought a different battle, a more personal one, surrounded by the echoes of home. "Here you go," Agnes said, placing a steaming cup in front of him. "I made it just the way you like it." "Thanks, Mom," he replied as he wrapped his fingers around the warm mug, letting the warmth seep into his bones. "Tell me about your day, darling," she encouraged, sitting across from him. Her silver hair framed her face softly, her eyes reflecting the love and concern only a mother could possess. "It was quiet. I went for a walk at the park. Just me and my thoughts." A shadow passed over his face as he spoke, his memories mixing like the swirling steam rising from his cup. "Quiet isn't always bad, you know. It gives you time to think." Agnes smiled, but her brow furrowed slightly. "You should get out more, Carl. Meet new people. Find a hobby." "I have a hobby, Mom. This place. It's my family's legacy." He gestured around the room, where shelves were lined with his father's woodworking projects, each one telling a story, each scarred piece of wood a reflection of time and effort. "It's my way of keeping them alive. But you don't have to carry that burden alone. What about volunteering? Or joining that veterans group?" "They do pottery classes," Agnes suggested, her enthusiasm bubbling over like the kettle on the stove. "Pottery?" Carl chuckled, shaking his head. "Mom, I can barely carve a straight line. Can you imagine me trying to mold clay? I'd probably end up with something that resembles, well, I don't know, a lopsided ashtray." His mother's laughter filled the room, a warm sound that made Carl's heart lift slightly. "And yet, I bet it would be the most charming lopsided ashtray anyone ever saw," Agnes said with a wink. As they shared a laugh, memories whirled with the warmth of nostalgia. Carl leaned back in his chair, pondering his mother's words. He knew she meant well, she always did. Yet, the thought of stepping out into a world that felt foreign, where the rhythms of life had changed the way a tide erases footprints in sand, set off a tremor of anxiety deep within him. "I appreciate you, Mom," he said softly, sincerity etched into his features. "But you know I've always been a lone wolf. I'd rather create something from nothing than share my space with others who might not understand what it means to earn a life through blood, sweat, and tears." Agnes softened her gaze, her voice warm. "Carl, your service taught you about sacrifice, about brotherhood. Sometimes, it's good to let others in. You don't have to carry all of this on your own. You're allowed to lean on someone else once in a while. The world didn't ask you to carry all your burdens in silence." Carl was quiet, swirling the tea in his cup, contemplating her words. Mom had always been the lighthouse in the stormy seas of his life. Even after all these years, she knew just how to guide him back to shore. "Maybe," he finally replied, a note of uncertainty in his voice. "But it's hard to change. It feels safer hiding behind my own walls, like this house, built brick by brick. Then maybe it's time to build a new form of shelter, one that opens its doors rather than closes them." Agnes rose from her seat and walked over to the window, gazing out at the garden. "Remember how your father planted those roses? It took years for them to bloom. Life requires patience, Carl. Just like relationships." He nodded, absorbing her wisdom. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting shadows that danced with the leaving light. "You know, I had a close friend in the army, Ralph. We used to talk about life after. How we'd adjust to the quietness after the chaos. I never thought I'd miss that chaos, Mom. You miss the camaraderie, the purpose. Agnes turned to face him. You can have both here. You just need to allow yourself to be vulnerable again. Vulnerable, huh? Carl raised an eyebrow, a half-smile forming on his lips. It's not something I'm practicing these days. There's strength in vulnerability, my dear son. It's what brings people together. Maybe find a project, something that combines your love for craftsmanship with others. Carl mulled over her suggestion, feeling the stirrings of curiosity emerge. Could he really step outside of his comforts? The thought of finding a purpose in something new, a project with people who shared his history, an outlet to transform chaos into creation, felt like a thrilling and terrifying prospect. The kettle whistled in the kitchen, bringing him back to reality, and Agnes filled in the silence. What's the worst that could happen? I might turn that lopsided ashtray into a modern art exhibit, Carl quipped, laughter bubbling in his chest again. Exactly. We'll hang a sign outside, Carl's Creations, where everything is guaranteed to be unique. Agnes replied, her laughter contagious. Maybe his mother was right. Maybe it was time to open the door, to place faith in the unfamiliar again. And as he lifted his cup of tea, taking a sip of warmth that mirrored the newfound hope blooming inside him, Carl realized that sometimes the walls you build aren't meant to be fortresses but rather foundations to build better, more vibrant lives. All right, Mom, he said, determination igniting his voice. Let's see what this project is all about. And with that, in the twilight shadows of the life he had earned, Carl found a small spark of adventure that flickered, promising to illuminate the path ahead. The sun dawned on the quiet little town, casting a golden hue across the front yard of Carl's home, where vibrant daisies danced in the gentle breeze. The familiar sound of birds greeted him as he poured his morning coffee, with its rich aroma curling through the air, a blend of comfort and anticipation. It was Saturday, his favorite day for tinkering around the house, lost in his projects while the world bustled outside. As he stepped onto the porch, Carl felt a shiver of change fluttering through the air. From his vantage point, he could see the recently vacated homes across the street now bustling with life. Boxes after boxes were being unloaded, and excited voices carried through the morning air. New families were moving in, a reality Carl hadn't anticipated. Hey, Carl! A voice broke through his musings. He recognized the man waving, a friendly face from the past, Tim, who had lived a few doors down until he moved away a year ago. Tim, good to see you back around, Carl called out, surprised but pleased to see his old neighbor. They exchanged pleasantries, reminiscing briefly about neighborhood barbecues and late-night fishing trips. Looks like new families are taking over, huh? Tim remarked, glancing towards the growing congregation across the street, where young couples bustled with enthusiasm, children laughing and playing in the yard. Seems like it, Carl replied, the knot of concern growing tighter in the pit of his stomach. But that just means change, I suppose. Change, indeed. Tim chuckled, taking a sip from his own mug. We talked about it a bit when we were moving. We had some neighbors who formed a homeowners association down the road. It kept the neighborhood looking sharp, with rules about lawns and decorations. HOA! Carl repeated aloud, trying to reconcile the acronyms with the visions of what that could mean for his autonomy. Yeah, it seems like a solid idea at first, but can easily turn into a headache. They'll tell you what to plant, when to mow the lawn, or even how high your flag can fly. It's a small-town tyranny, I tell you. Tim laughed, but there was a glint of seriousness in his eyes, one that Carl recognized as the mark of someone who had experienced the consequences firsthand. Realizing that Tim's casual offhand comment struck a deeper chord, Carl nodded slowly. The thought of outsiders dictating what he could do with his own yard, his small sanctuary, set his heart racing. I've worked hard to carve out my space here. It's taken decades to make it mine. It's your home, Carl. What you've done here with your hands and heart is what makes this place special, Tim replied. But if they come with rules, you might want to consider what that means for you and your garden. Thanks for the heads up. Carl's voice held a note of discontent. The sprawling sanctity of freedom he cherished felt as if it were being threatened by the surges of change, and the arrival of an HOA felt like the encroachment of a grayscale sky pressing upon his color-rich life. As Tim waved goodbye and walked off to catch up with the newcomers, Carl turned back to his porch, leaning heavily on the railing. He took a long, contemplative sip of coffee and watched as families mingled, their laughter ringing hollow to his ears. Within him swirled a tempest, an uneasiness shaken from the roots of his long-held independence. The following days brought a barrage of new sounds, faces, and voices. Kids raced through the neighborhood, bicycles squeaking against the pavement, and the laughter of children reverberated like an anthem heralding the passage through time. But as the charm of those sounds filled the air, whispers of the suggested homeowners association became louder among the newcomers. "Did you see the brochure for the HOA?" the young woman across the street had said to a neighbor just as Carl had stepped out for an evening walk. "They want to have a meeting to discuss how they'll keep this place cohesive." "I'm excited. It's nice to know someone will be looking out for us." Carl's heart sank. Looking out sounded lovely in theory, but he sensed a tightening grip on his autonomy, a palpable threat to his cherished sanctuary, the freedom to cultivate and nurture as he pleased. 2 evenings later, during an outdoor gathering to welcome the new families, Carl reluctantly attended, feeling more like an alien in his own land rather than a welcoming neighbor. The picnic tables were set, and colorful banners fluttered as children chased about, unaware of the whispered discussions swirling around them. "Great turnout, huh?" one of the men smiled, offering Carl a plate of freshly grilled burgers. "This way, everyone can meet and greet. We want our neighborhood to be friendly, connected." "What's wrong with that?" "Nothing at all," Carl replied, but he knew the silence brewing underneath the chatter. Beneath the warm smile lay the anxiety of uncertainty. Soon enough, conversation naturally transitioned into the topic of the HOA. "We're proposing some guidelines," a woman explained passionately, her eyes shining with determination. "Just basic things. Maintaining yard aesthetics, ensuring we all contribute to the look and feel of our neighborhood. Who wouldn't want their home to look its best?" Carl remained quiet, his heart racing as anger and fear curled together in a tight ball. "Are we really going to let a small group dictate what everyone can do?" he thought, images of his father's wooden crafts swirling in his mind, memories of the beauty each personal touch brought to his home. As discussions continued, Carl found himself standing closer to the periphery of the gathering, feeling exposed with every passing minute. Other voices began to rise, some echoing his concerns while others sang praises for order and beauty. But Carl wasn't alone in his discontent. At that moment, as he glanced around, he recognized a familiar face nestled in the crowd, the elderly Mr. Jenkins who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. Carl approached him, quietly stepping away from the group. "Jenkins," Carl greeted, relieved to see someone who remembered the way things were before change swept in with such zeal. "Carl, good to see you," Mr. Jenkins said with a smile, albeit uncertain. "This HOA business has everyone all riled up, hasn't it? Back in my day, we kept things simple. Everyone knew each other and looked after one another without an HOA looming over us." "Exactly. What does it matter how tidy my lawn is? It's about heart and how we maintain our homes, our individuality." Carl spoke, his voice rising, fueled by a passion brewing within him. "I don't want to be boxed in by rules that strip away who I am." Mr. Jenkins nodded sagely. "That's the risk, Carl. This world has a way of trying to squeeze people into molds they don't fit. You're right to be concerned." As the sun set on the horizon, casting shades of orange and purple across the sky, Carl felt the storm of emotions raging within him. The warmth of neighborly camaraderie came with unexpected conditions, the call for conformity and control hidden behind the guise of community spirit. "Something needs to be done about this," Carl muttered resolutely to Mr. Jenkins. "They can't decide for us what our lives should look like. I need to address this at the next meeting." "Careful, Carl," Jenkins cautioned, but a glimmer of respect sparkled in his eye. "Sometimes the loudest voices are the ones that ignite the fiercest storms." That evening, as Carl made his way home, his heart thrummed with apprehension and determination, battling inside him like an ocean before a storm. He knew his autonomy was at stake, and come what may, he would make sure his voice was heard amidst the winds of change. In the days that followed, the sense of urgency to solidify his beliefs grew inside him like an ember catching fire. 4 years, Carl had carved his path, nurturing his sanctuary with love and labor. Little did he know, the real battle was just beginning, one that would redefine not just his home but his very understanding of community, connection, and the essence of freedom. The following week had dawned cloaked in a veil of unease, with gray clouds brewing ominously above Carl's modest home. As he sipped his morning coffee, eyes wandering over the closely trimmed lawns of new neighbors, thoughts of the impending HOA meeting loomed in his mind. Voices of excitement rang through the neighborhood, yet Carl's heart thudded with a different rhythm, one painted in shades of uncertainty and defiance. Just as he resolved himself for the day, a sudden knock on the door jolted him from his reverie. A sense of foreboding settled over him, and as he approached, he braced himself for yet another encounter involving the new families that were sprouting like weeds. With a slow exhale, Carl opened the door to find a sharp-suited man standing before him, a clipboard tucked under his arm. "Good morning. You must be Carl," the man beamed, extending his hand. "I'm Greg Turner, the neighborhood liaison for the newly forming Homeowners Association." Carl hesitated before shaking the man's hand, immediately feeling the pressure of a corporate handshake trying too hard to be friendly. "Hi, Greg. What can I do for you?" "I wanted to discuss the Homeowners Association that's getting off the ground. It's an exciting opportunity for all of us to foster community spirit and enhance the aesthetics of our block." Greg's voice was polished and enthusiastic, the kind typically used in sales pitches. "Sounds interesting," Carl replied non-committally, leaning against the doorframe. "But I've heard enough chatter about it already. We don't really need any rules intruding on our lives, do we?" Greg chuckled lightly, as if brushing aside Carl's obvious unease. "I completely understand your hesitation. But a homeowners association means everyone can contribute to keeping our neighborhood looking its best. It's all about standards, common rules to maintain the property values and overall appeal of our homes." "What kind of rules?" Carl interrupted, his brow furrowing as a hint of challenge seeped into his tone. "Just simple guidelines," Greg assured him, pulling out a pamphlet with bullet points laid out in clean, enticing graphics. Things like maintaining yard heights, paint colors allowed on house exteriors, and standards for fences. "We want to ensure that everyone's property looks cohesive. You'll find that living amongst others who share the same commitment elevates everyone's experience." Carl's skepticism bubbled beneath the surface. "So, you're saying if I want to paint my house a color I choose, I need the HOA's approval?" "Precisely," Greg replied, excitement coursing through his voice. "It's about working together to create a sense of unity. Besides, it'll keep our property values high. If one house falters, the others can be pulled down with it." The imagery painted by Greg's words felt claustrophobic. Carl shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that he was on the threshold of surrendering a part of his independence. "But what if someone doesn't agree with those standards?" he probed, caution evident in his tone. "That's what the meetings are for," Greg replied, keeping an upbeat demeanor. "We'll have discussions and voting to decide these matters. A little compromise can go a long way in the name of community." "Compromise," Carl echoed, but the sound of it in his mouth felt sour. "Where I come from, my neighborhood is my canvas. I like to paint it my own way. Trust me, Carl. Hauling everyone onto the same page can be challenging at first. But once the routines are established, you'll find it makes life easier," Greg insisted, his smile faltering for just a brief moment, replaced by something more serious. "And compliance will soon become mandatory for newcomers. You'll want to be part of that conversation rather than stand out as the lone wolf." Carl felt his heart quiver within his chest. Those words echoed hollow against the backdrop of his pride in his home, and he could already taste the bitterness of conformity. "I appreciate your time, Greg. But right now, my allegiance is to my own choices. I have to think about all of this." Carl stepped back slightly, signaling an end to the conversation. Greg maintained his bright, if somewhat strained, smile. "Of course. But I'll be around if you change your mind. Just remember, it's all for the common good." The front door clicked shut softly between them, but once alone in his living room, Carl leaned against the wall, the turmoil within him akin to the tempest churning in the sky outside. The relentless push for conformity loomed larger with every new face he met, and a sense of siege settled on his shoulders. He recalled Mr. Jenkins' wise words from the gathering, the warning about how loud voices create storms. He had never intended to become the opposition, but as more newcomers arrived with their enthusiasm for rules and order, Carl found himself awaiting the exact moment to step into the fray. He stepped toward his workspace, the familiar scent of sawdust calming him as he traced the edges of his current project. A wooden bench, detailed with personal carvings that captured a lifetime of memories. His sanctuary called to him, a reminder of who he was and the choices he had made. With each cut and every stroke, Carl felt a growing resolve. He would not bend to the will of newcomers eager to impose standards that stripped away individuality and, ultimately, freedom. He could hear whispers of rebellion growing within his heart. The strong urge to protect his sanctuary became undeniable. The HOA meetings were fast approaching. Carl would prepare himself not only for a conversation about compliance but also to defend his right to exist outside of conformity as a proud homeowner, not just a number or a name on a clipboard. The idea of engaging in conflict didn't fill him with dread. Instead, it ignited a flicker of determination within him. As the winds outside picked up, Carl closed his eyes and leaned into the flow of creativity. He was crafting not just furniture, doors, or decorations. He was shaping a stronghold, a manifesto of identity built from hard work, resilience, and a refusal to yield. As the storm clouds gathered overhead, the fight for his home had begun. And Carl, the lone wolf, was not afraid to howl. The days melted into weeks, and with each passing moment, the tension within Carl's quiet sanctuary grew more palpable. The once relaxing atmosphere of his beloved home felt heavy under the specter of the newly established homeowners association that seemed to breathe down his neck. Visits from eager members, whispers of rules, and the sound of clipboards flipping became a constant nagging hum that he could no longer ignore. As Carl tended to his garden one sunny afternoon, his hands buried in the rich soil, he heard footsteps crunching against the gravel path leading to his front door. Thoughts of Greg and the HOA flooded his mind, and he straightened up, wiping sweat from his brow. Instinctively, a flicker of apprehension rippled through him, but he shook it off, insisting to himself that he could not be intimidated in his own home. A moment later, a crisp envelope was shoved through the slightly ajar front door. Carl was struck dumb, the sight of it causing his heart to race. With a flick of his thumb, he opened the envelope, revealing a letter penned with sharp, straightforward lines. "Dear homeowner," it read, "we have noted multiple violations of the neighborhood standards, as established during the HOA meeting. Specifically, your lawn default exceeds the permissible length, which can detract from the overall aesthetic of our community. Please rectify this issue within 5 days to avoid further action. Thank you for your cooperation." His stomach knotted with disbelief. Carl crumpled the letter in his hand. This was it, the first shot across the bow, a call to conformity wrapped in polite language that dripped with hypocrisy. "I'm not a member," he muttered fiercely to himself. "Their rules have no power over me." Carl tossed the letter aside, focusing on his plants, letting the tension seep from his fingers into the rich soil. Unfortunately, he couldn't shake off the growing unease, nor the nagging realization that he was very much alone in his defiance. Most of his neighbors had embraced the HOA with open arms, coaxing smiles and nods of camaraderie at the neighborhood gatherings that Carl increasingly avoided. Over the following days, that initial letter was followed by a series of increasingly aggressive warnings, each one more elaborate in its claims of violations. Each smooth, official letter crafted by the HOA dripped with insulated authority. Violations of paint colors, flower types, and the ever-growing laundry list of rules. The chirp of birds and the sweet bloom of flowers felt overshadowed by an oppressive weight pressing down on his soul. "It's only a matter of time, Carl," Tim warned during an unexpected visit. "You know they'll start making examples of people who don't comply." "I won't comply," Carl retorted, a pulse of defiance spark igniting within him. "These are my decisions to make. They can dictate all they want, but I'm not going to yield." "That's admirable, but think about what you're up against. When did maintaining something beautiful become a crime? Many of us are tired of people like Greg acting as enforcers with no real understanding of our neighborhood. It feels like an invasion." Tim's concern was genuine, But Carl felt determination rising like a tide. Within him bubbled a steadfast resolve. He would fight, not fight against the people but against the idea of being ruled by someone else's vision of beauty. He would carve out a space for his home and identity, refusing to allow the authoritarian grip of the HOA to suffocate his freedom. That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Carl found himself standing on his porch, surveying his property. The dim light illuminated the hand-carved details and carefully tended flowers, each a testament to his effort and care over the years. This was not just property. It was the essence of his being, the soul of his craft and labor. Yet the shadows of concern crept closer as reality set in. The HOA's insistence on conformity was becoming a very real menace. As he pulled away from the edge of despair, determination gripped Carl once more. It was time to prepare for the next meeting, time to voice his resistance and anchor himself firmly in the midst of the storm. Carl spent the following days poring over the HOA documents that had circulated among neighbors. With each page, he unearthed a growing strength within him, discovering alliances were forming, albeit quietly. He could sense other residents, perhaps like him, uncomfortable with the growing authoritarianism of their once peaceful neighborhood. They may not stand behind him publicly, but perhaps privately, they too held similar concerns. On the night of the next HOA meeting, Carl was ready. He stood before his front door, heart pounding with resolve as he slipped his feet into sturdy boots. He wore the casual attire that felt most comfortable, far removed from the crisp suits of the HOA leaders. This was not a fight about appearances. It was about freedom. As he walked toward the community center, he noticed familiar faces drifting in, some animated with excitement while others wore a veil of apprehension. But Carl bore a fierce determination, the crackling energy of rebellion creating warmth in his chest. Inside, the atmosphere was charged with tension. Several members spoke with fervor about installing stricter rules in response to the many violations they had observed. Carl forced himself to stand steady, refusing to allow doubt to cascade over him. Once the floor opened for public comments, Carl took a deep breath and stepped forward, adopting a posture of confidence. The words that spilled from his mouth were not just complaints, they were a plea to remember the roots of their community, the bond shared through experiences, laughter, and the unique expressions each homeowner contributed to the neighborhood's collective spirit. "I understand the desire for cohesion," Carl began, his voice steady. "But those regulations you propose overlook the very fabric that makes us who we are. Our individuality is what breathes life into this neighborhood. I believe we should celebrate our differences, not conform to a rigid model." Whispers erupted, rippling through the crowd, and Carl could feel eyes on him. He pressed on, forthright and unyielding, calling for empathy, collaboration rather than conformity, determination rather than division. Moments stretched on, his passion echoing off the walls, sparking flickers of recognition among other attendees. Perhaps he was not entirely alone in this battle after all. The HOA president acknowledged Carl's remarks with a tense smile, but behind the facade, Carl sensed the cracks beginning to show. Resistance was gathering momentum, a shift against the suffocating grip of conformity. As Carl left the meeting that evening, eyes frosted with uncertainty and anticipation, he knew that the full weight of this struggle was yet to unfold. This was just the beginning, a battle for the heart of their neighborhood, the fight for individuality emboldened by resilience. Within the soil of his beloved home, Carl felt the roots of determination sink deeper, intertwining with the very essence of his identity. The storm would come. He could feel it in the wind's gathering strength. He firmly believed that if he stood resolute, the cracks in their facade of control would only widen, eventually giving way to a new dawn of freedom he was determined to nurture. In the weeks that followed the HOA meeting, Carl's moment of courage was quickly met with startling retaliation. What he had feared most, a shift from passive complaints to active enforcement, became a harsh reality. The self-appointed officers of the HOA took it upon themselves to patrol the neighborhood, armed with questionable authority and an insatiable appetite for control. It all started with whispers echoing through the streets, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps beneath the canopy of budding trees. From his window, Carl watched a trio of neighbors huddled together, clutching their clipboards and exchanging furtive glances as they strolled through the community. They'd been transformed into the HOA police, a unit formed not for the protection of their home but for the enforcement of vague rules that served only to stifle individuality. The following day, as Carl pruned the lavender bushes that flanked his porch, the unmistakable sight of Greg and his two companions strode down the sidewalk. Carl's unease returned, shadowed by the rising tide of anxiety in his chest. As the trio ambled closer, he turned his back, trying to focus on the task at hand, hoping they'd pass by without incident. But the familiar, overly cheerful tone of Greg broke through the rustling leaves. "Good morning, Carl. Just doing a little neighborhood round. We're checking in on compliance with the guidelines." "You mean the rules you made up?" Carl replied without turning around, anger simmering beneath his calm facade. Now, every rule serves a purpose," Greg coaxed. "We want to ensure our community maintains a high standard. For example, did you know that your lavender bushes are taller than the allowed height?" Carl felt his grip tighten around the pruning shears, slicing through the air as he turned toward Greg. "Higher than what standard?" "I haven't seen any actual rules to back this up, just your selective interpretation." But we have criteria outlined in our guidelines," Greg insisted, his smile faltering but his tone maintaining a veneer of friendliness. "We simply want to cultivate a cohesive environment." "Cultivate or control?" Carl challenged, the frustration boiling over, the tight rope of civility threatening to snap. Before Greg could respond, the other two officers chimed in, their voices raised with feigned indignation. "We can cite you for this, you know," one of them declared, a neighbor named Molly, who previously had been affable over backyard barbecues. "Cite me? For what?" "Growing my lavender." Carl laughed bitterly, unable to comprehend how the people he once shared pleasantries with transformed into harbingers of rule-based oppression. Molly rolled her eyes, trying to sound authoritative. "You may want to review the guidelines we provided during last month's meeting, Carl. All community members are expected to uphold them. We can't be lenient with violators." Carl felt the heat radiate from his chest to his cheeks. "Your leniency means squeezing out any hint of creativity. It means stifling the spirit of our community in exchange for uniformity. I won't apologize for taking pride in my home." With that declaration hanging in the air, Carl chose to turn away, leaving the intruders to contemplate their next move. But the feeling of calm that settled over him was ephemeral. Weeks turned into a relentless march of complaints, citations, and warning letters that began raining down upon his doorstep like confetti at a deeply unsettling celebration. His property violations, from excessive flower types to unauthorized paint colors on the fence, spiraled into an avalanche of petty judgments. The neighborhood felt like a brewing cauldron, each letter fueling the fire of resistance among some residents while others cowered in compliance. The more Carl stoked the flames, the louder the HOA police grew, circling him with unease like hungry wolves sensing weakness. As the days turned into nights, Carl felt suffocated within the walls of his once comforting home. He found himself swallowing down the bitter taste of isolation as the letters stacked up like bricks in invisible walls. Still, he refused to give in. Then came the most challenging evening yet. On a Wednesday, an unexpected knock echoed through the house, and Carl, still soaked from the rain, wrapped a towel around himself and headed for the door. Before him stood a group of 4 HOA officers, each statement dripping from their lips like condensation off a glass cup, a meeting of supposed righteousness. "Carl, we need to address your continued disregard for community regulations," Greg began, glancing at the enforcing members beside him, a trio of neighbors charmed into believing they were deemed the protectors of compliance. "The HOA received numerous complaints about your lack of action on the warnings. That's ludicrous. You're banding together like a vigilante group, addressing nothing but the discontent you've brewed. What's next? Rounding up anyone who refuses to fall in line." Carl snapped, the well of frustration spilling over. Now, let's avoid escalating this further," Greg countered, but a bitterness lurked beneath the surface of his concerning smile. "We need you to either comply with our standards or arrange for a meeting with the board. If you don't, or what? You'll fine me for having the audacity to love my home." Carl's voice rose, echoing down the quiet street, startling even the birds perched above. The response came quickly, laced with the air of superiority. "We have talked amongst ourselves and decided that failing to comply could result in hefty fines. You can't expect us to allow unchecked variance in our community." Carl clenched his fists, feeling the weight of his pride battling against this facade of authority. "If you think I'll buckle under your unwarranted regime, you're sorely mistaken. This isn't a community if you're treating us as the enemy." Before Greg could retort, Carl turned on his heel and backed into the safety of his home, slamming the door shut with such force that the handle rattled. A rush of adrenaline coursed through him, though it was laced with the fear of what came next. In the following days, Carl found himself scrutinizing every corner of his yard and home, as if waiting for judgment to descend upon him like a storm cloud. However, something began to unveil from within him, a quivering notion of resistance, a desire to gather others who felt the same discontent. He reached out to neighbors during quiet moments, strategizing in hushed tones and forging a bond through shared frustrations. Perhaps it was time to stage an uprising against the newly self-appointed powers that governed their lives, an effort that could unravel the authoritarian grip tightening around their community. Perhaps he wouldn't just defend his home, he would lead a movement, a call to arms against the HOA police, their powers built on fear and intimidation. The ethos of individuality was a seed buried deep in the cracked soil of his yard, and he was determined to cultivate it, no matter the consequences. Soon enough, a storm was set to brew. Change was in the air, palpable and electric. And this time, Carl was ready. The confrontation with the HOA patrol still lingered in Carl's mind as he stepped into his house, slamming the door behind him. The adrenaline rush from the exchange had yet to subside, his heart pounding against his chest like a drum in a frantic rhythm. He had never felt so invaded, so disrespected in his own home. The audacity of the HOA to assume such authority over his life was infuriating. Stepping into the kitchen to grab a glass of water, Carl noticed something amiss. The window above the sink was open, and the curtains billowed gently in the evening breeze. He was certain he had closed it before leaving for his walk. A shiver ran down his spine as he felt an uninvited presence lingering in the air. Moving cautiously, he began to inspect the house, room by room. Everything seemed in order until he reached the backyard. The sight before him made his blood run cold. His beautiful lavender bushes, the ones he had so meticulously pruned and cared for, lay trampled and broken. The fence he had painted with such care, the one the HOA had deemed unauthorized, was now smeared with vulgar graffiti. Carl's eyes welled up with tears, a mixture of anger and despair. This was no ordinary act of vandalism. It was a calculated attack, a message from the HOA that they would stop at nothing to break his spirit. The realization that someone had invaded his private space, his sanctuary, was deeply unsettling. With trembling hands, Carl pulled out his phone and dialed the police. He had been hesitant to involve them before, hoping the situation would resolve itself or that reason would prevail. But this was different. This was a blatant act of intimidation, a criminal offense. As he waited for the police to arrive, Carl documented every detail of the vandalism. He took pictures of the destroyed plants, the defaced fence, and even the open window. He made a mental note of every conversation he had with the HOA, every warning and every threat. This time, he was prepared to fight back with concrete evidence. The police arrived promptly, and Carl greeted them at the door. Officer Johnson, a middle-aged man with a kind face, listened intently as Carl recounted the events leading up to the vandalism. Carl showed him the pictures and explained the ongoing feud with the HOA. Officer Johnson's expression turned from sympathetic to concerned. "Mr. Carl, this is serious. We'll do our best to investigate and find out who's behind this. But I have to advise you, these kinds of cases can be tricky. We'll need your cooperation and any evidence you can provide. Carl nodded, determination etched on his face. I'm willing to cooperate fully. I have all the records of our disputes, including emails and photos of the warnings they've given me. I believe this is more than just random vandalism. It's a targeted attack by the HOA to intimidate me into compliance. The officer nodded, jotting down some notes. We'll look into it. In the meantime, I recommend you consider increasing your home security. Install some cameras, motion-sensitive lights. We can also provide you with a patrol car to keep an eye on your house for a while. As the police left and Carl began the process of securing his home, a sense of resolve hardened within him. This act of vandalism had crossed a line, turning what was once a dispute over rules into a personal attack. Carl was no longer just fighting for his right to express himself through his home. He was fighting against bullying, against the misuse of power by a group of self-appointed guardians of conformity. The next morning, Carl woke up to the sound of hammers and drills. He had hired a team to repair the fence and replace the destroyed plants. As he watched them work, he felt a sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this act of vandalism would be the catalyst for change. Maybe it would bring attention to the HOA's overreach and prompt the community to stand up against such abuse of power. With renewed energy, Carl decided to take his fight to the next level. He would organize a community meeting, invite the press, and expose the HOA's tactics for what they were: an attempt to strangle individuality and freedom. The time for silence was over. The time for action had begun. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the neighborhood, Carl stood in his backyard, looking at the newly repaired fence. It was more than just a piece of wood. It was a symbol of his resistance, a declaration that he would not be intimidated or silenced. The battle between Carl and the HOA had just escalated, but Carl was ready. He was no longer alone in this fight. He had the law, his community, and his unyielding spirit on his side. The days following the police investigation escalated into a whirlwind of emotions for Carl. What had once felt like an isolated battle now transformed into a quest for justice, gathering momentum with each passing hour. The camera he had bought on a whim weeks earlier became the instrumental tool in exposing the shadowy undercurrents of the HOA's malicious intentions. Upon reviewing the footage, Officer Johnson had been incredulous. Carl had unwittingly recorded members of the HOA patrol lurking around his property the very night of the vandalism, their silhouettes framed against the flickering streetlight. Laughter could be faintly heard, a mocking tone that suggested an intent far darker than petty enforcement. Within days, the police had acted decisively. They returned to the HOA officers' homes, armed with Carl's video evidence, arresting Greg and his accomplices on charges of vandalism and trespassing. For the first time in months, Carl felt an exhilarating rush of empowerment. The tide was turning. They were no longer the hunters, and he was no longer the prey. The news of the arrests spread like wildfire, igniting conversations at coffee shops and across crowded driveways. Residents who had once sided with the HOA began to question their motives. Factions formed within the community, some standing by their newfound ally in Carl, while others struggled to reconcile their earlier fear with the undeniable truth unfolding before them. When the trial was set to commence, Carl instinctively knew he had to tell his story. This wasn't just about his personal plight. It had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power. He prepared diligently, recalling every interaction, every threat, and every warning that had passed between him and the HOA. The day of the trial was saturated with tension. Carl entered the courtroom, the familiar air of authority mingling with a palpable sense of justice. As the bailiff called the court to order, Carl took a seat among the audience. His heart pounding as he waited for the proceedings to begin. The prosecutor, a sharp-minded attorney named Elaine, stood to present her opening statement. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, today you will hear about a man who fought to maintain his dignity and to protect his home from those who sought to oppress him. This case isn't just about vandalism. It's about bullying and the abuse of authority. We intend to show that these self-appointed HOA officers engaged in a conspiracy to intimidate Mr. Carl and enforce arbitrary guidelines. As the trial unfolded, Carl listened intently, recounting the events that had led to this moment. He spoke of the countless times he had offered friendly repartees to his neighbors, only to find them plotting to undermine his home and spirit. With each testimony, the picture became clearer. Those who had once seemed like guardians of the community had, in truth, formed a cabal of mediocrity determined to suppress anyone daring enough to disrupt their vision of conformity. When it was finally Carl's turn to take the stand, he stood tall, fueled by a sense of purpose. He spoke passionately, detailing the vandalism, the threats, and the impact it had on his life. His words resonated in the courtroom, painting a vivid narrative that captured not only the injustices he had faced but also the universal struggle for self-expression against societal pressure. "I had no intention of breaking any unwritten rules," Carl declared, his voice firm. "But what began as a minor disagreement quickly devolved into a harassment campaign driven by a fear of individuality. These so-called officers sought to silence my expression of creativity and strip my home of its character. It didn't just hurt me, it hurt the community by fostering a culture of fear and intimidation." As Carl's voice echoed in the chamber, the jury's faces reflected a dawning realization. What had once seemed trivial, his choice of flowers, the paint on his fence, was actually a manifestation of his freedom, an expression of identity throttled by the oppressive grip of the HOA. The testimonies of other residents only fanned the flames of outrage. A neighbor named Karen spoke about the fear instilled in her when she received a warning for planting flowers that were deemed non-native. Another resident, Tom, candidly recounted moments when he had been scrutinized for letting his grass grow a little too high during a particularly rainy summer. As witnesses shared their experiences, evidence continued to pile against the HOA officers. Pictorial and video evidence demonstrated not only the destruction of Carl's property but also cruelty wrapped in the guise of community oversight. Each detail woven into the narrative made it abundantly clear the HOA officers had crossed a line. Closing arguments from both sides followed, each vying for the attention of the jury. Elaine succinctly summarized the case with conviction, reinforcing the idea that Carl had been victimized by an organization designed to ensure harmony, however misguided. Their actions were not about upholding community standards. They were about enforcing control, she insisted, her gaze unwavering. When the defense finally made their case, a procedural mirage emerged. They attempted to discredit Carl by labeling him uncooperative and a troublemaker, arguing that he had instigated conflict. But their attempts were met with skepticism from the jury, who were visibly perturbed by the HOA's history of intimidation. The jury deliberated, the room thick with anticipation. Carl could feel the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him, yet tinged with hope. Finally, the jury returned with a verdict. As the foreperson spoke, the room held its breath. Guilty on all counts of vandalism and trespassing. Tears of relief streamed down Carl's face. Justice was served. Finally, he could reclaim his peace of mind and heal from the trauma. The judge, recognizing the severity of the HOA officers' actions, sentenced them to community service, mandated training on community governance, and a fine requiring them to pay restitution to Carl for the damages. As Carl exited the courthouse, the sun shone brightly against the backdrop of a new beginning. His community emerged from the shadows together, finding solidarity in their shared experiences. With the HOA's tyranny laid bare, Carl envisioned vibrant gardens springing up again on every block, fences adorned with artistic flair rather than fear. Weeks later, the community held a gathering in the local park to celebrate newfound freedom. Carl addressed the crowd, his heart swelling with pride as he looked at the faces of those who had rallied together during the tumultuous storm. "Never again shall we allow fear to dictate our choices. Today, we reclaim our homes, our voices, and our community. Let's build a place where diversity and individuality are celebrated." The crowd erupted into applause, and Carl felt a wave of warmth wash over him. He had not only fought for his home but for the hearts of his neighbors. They would rise together, showing everyone that the essence of a community is not derived from conformity but from the uniqueness of each resident. In the end, it mattered not just that Carl had sought justice. He had ignited a movement. The HOA may have attempted to silence him, but they only sparked a fire, a flame of resistance blazing through the community, determined to protect the spirit of individuality for all. The aftermath of the criminal trial ushered in a transformative period for Carl, one where hope mingled with a sense of renewed purpose. While he had successfully brought the rogue HOA officers to justice, his mind turned toward a more formidable opponent, the HOA itself. Carl was fueled by passion, a desire not just for personal reparation but for an end to their tyrannical rule over his peaceful neighborhood. As the spring sun cast warmth over the blossoming gardens, Carl convened a meeting in his living room, inviting fellow residents to voice their thoughts about the HOA's control. Word had spread through the community of his recent success. His neighbors were eager to join him in discussing the next steps. The room was packed, an eclectic gathering of voices who had previously felt unheard. Sitting among them were retirees, families, newcomers, and lifelong residents, all united by a common thread, a disdain for the HOA's overreach. After pleasantries were exchanged, Carl stood up, a wave of determination coursing through him. "Thank you all for coming. Together, we can stand against the intimidation and control the HOA has exercised over our lives for too long. I propose we file a civil lawsuit, not just for reparations or punitive damages for myself, but to dismantle a flawed system that has wrought havoc in our community. This is about justice for all of us." As murmurs of agreement rumbled through the crowd, Carl laid out the strategies he envisioned. He explained the myriad of grievances they could address, from unauthorized fines to baseless complaints about home aesthetics that suffocated individuality. Each neighbor shared their own experiences, creating a potent collective testimony that painted a vivid picture of an opaque bureaucracy run amok. "I once received a letter for not trimming my hedges enough," one resident chimed in. "They said it was ruining the property value. We could barely afford to pay our mortgage, let alone hire a landscaper to conform to their standards. I had to dye my house a dull beige after being threatened with fines," another neighbor added, voicing frustration that resonated with everyone in the room. "My color choice was part of my identity, but they only see property value." With each shared story, Carl's resolve solidified. They were not simply fighting for their rights as homeowners, they were fighting for the character and essence of their neighborhood. Over the next few weeks, Carl worked tenaciously to build the foundation of their lawsuit. He collaborated with a lawyer who specialized in civil cases against homeowners associations, eager to ensure they covered every angle. The goal was ambitious but clear, to not only seek financial restitution for the damage suffered, but to challenge the very framework that empowered the HOA to bully its members. In meticulous preparation, Carl gathered evidence including the now infamous video footage that had sparked outrage, testimonies from numerous residents, and records of HOA interactions that overwhelmingly painted a picture of abuse of power. Each item meticulously documented laid the groundwork for what they hoped would become a pivotal legal victory over an entity that had operated above the law for too long. The day of filing the lawsuit arrived, and Carl stood outside the courthouse, flanked by his neighbors. They clasped hands, determination bright in their eyes, ready to take their stand. The atmosphere was electric, buoyed by the shared burden of their fight. For them, it was not simply about righting wrongs. It was a battle that could reshape their neighborhood's future. "Let's send a message to the HOA, Carl said, raising his voice for all to hear. "We refuse to be silenced. We refuse to live under the tyranny of fear. Today, we reclaim our right to live freely and authentically in our homes." With the lawsuit officially filed, they watched as Carl's name appeared alongside theirs, a powerful statement of unity in the face of oppression. As the weeks turned into months, Carl's journey magnified the issues that had silently plagued countless neighborhoods. Their case gained traction in the local media, sparking discussions in community gatherings, and highlighting the need for reform in homeowners associations. Carl found himself becoming a reluctant but fervent face of the movement, advocating for change not only within his community but beyond. Together with his lawyer, media interviews became a platform. "How many others are out there who feel powerless?" Carl posed during a televised segment. "How many families have been bullied into silence by these organizations? A community should be built on support and understanding, not intimidation and fear." Slowly but surely, the tide began to turn. Residents who once sat on the sidelines began to engage more actively, discovering that they shared Carl's vision of a neighborhood where creativity and self-expression could flourish. Meetings expanded, creating action committees focused on advocating for new community guidelines that would replace the oppressive HOA rules. As the civil lawsuit approached trial, Carl and his neighbors honed their arguments, seeking to expose the HOA not merely as a regulatory entity but as a misused tool of oppression. They would assert that the HOA's guidelines were merely a facade, masking a more sinister agenda of preserving homogeneity at the cost of individuality, which ultimately poisoned their community spirit. The day of the civil trial arrived with palpable tension hanging thick in the air. Carl's heart raced as he glided into the courtroom, flanked by the neighbors who had become his comrades in this fight, a true testament to the power of solidarity. The proceedings commenced with an air of solemnity. Carl's attorney made the opening statement, articulating the essence of their struggle. The HOA was a beast that needed to be dismantled. As they presented their case, neighbors who had once felt invisible took their turns sharing their testimonies. Their stories culminated in a powerful narrative that amplified Carl's ultimate objective: community preservation through individual rights. As the trial unfolded, the HOA attempted to counter the claims, portraying themselves as the guardians of order who were simply ensuring property values remained stable. Yet, Carl's team executed their strategy deftly, revealing through cross-examination that the HOA's guidelines relied on outdated prejudices and arbitrary aesthetics rather than the collective will of the people. After days filled with tensions and revelations, the jury finally deliberated, each person acutely aware of the weight their decision carried. As the foreperson rose to deliver the verdict, Carl held his breath, the silence around him almost deafening. The words that followed echoed in the courtroom: "We the jury find in favor of the plaintiffs." Cheers erupted from their side, encapsulating years of shared struggles, while shock rippled through the HOA representatives. Carl felt tears stream down his cheeks, a euphoric release of pent-up emotion. As they filed out of the courthouse, laughter and exuberance filled the air. They had proven their point, not just for themselves, but for every homeowner oppressed by a system that prioritized blind conformity over community spirit. With the victory fresh on everyone's minds, Carl couldn't shake the feeling that this was merely the beginning. The HOA's reign of power had been challenged, but real change demanded continued vigilance. Inspired, he took it upon himself to lead discussions focused on reforming community governance, advocating for transparency and inclusiveness where every resident would have a voice. As Carl stood amidst his neighbors, he knew they had dismantled the beast, but their fight was not over. There were new horizons to explore and visions for the community to be forged together, where homes were not just properties but living expressions of the vibrant lives within them. He had ignited a movement, one that would resonate far beyond the confines of their neighborhood, and together, they would honor the spirit of individuality and community for generations to come. The echo of the jury's verdict faded into the background of Carl's life, overshadowed by the weight of everything that had transpired. Despite his monumental victory against the HOA, a sense of hollowness gnawed at him. The exhilaration of justice clashed with the lingering emotional scars from months of confrontation. In the aftermath of the trial, he found the vibrancy of his neighborhood dulled by a simmering tension that still flickered among some neighbors who had chosen sides during the conflict. Each day, Carl would drive past his once pristine home, now an emblem of struggle and survival. The flowers that bloomed in the garden, vibrant and wild, felt more like reminders of a battle fought than a testament to the beauty of individuality. He would sit in his living room, engulfed by silence, staring at the walls that had witnessed his sleepless nights filled with anxiety and fear, rather than the laughter and warmth he once cherished. The weight of his surroundings became increasingly unbearable. The specter of conflict loomed large, marred by an unshakable feeling that his haven had transformed into a battleground. The achievements he had celebrated began to feel like an iron chain, dragging him further from the happiness that had once filled his home. As the summer faded into a crisp autumn, Carl made a decision that felt both liberating and heartbreaking. He would sell his family home. With a heavy heart but a clearer mind, he envisioned something more serene, a sanctuary where he could heal and grow, free from the shadows of his past. The decision propelled him into a whirlwind of preparations. He painted over the stains of conflict, meticulously packing away memories, each box a small tribute to the life he was leaving behind. Friends from the neighborhood came by, offering support and sharing fond memories, the tensions easing as they celebrated Carl's bravery in taking control of his life. On the day of the final walkthrough, he felt a strange blend of sadness and anticipation. Each room echoed with whispers of laughter, but the sense of freedom imbued him with hope. As Carl closed the door for the last time, a wave of relief washed over him. He and the house had endured too much. It was time to part ways. With the sale completed, he turned his gaze toward the horizon, seeking a new adventure that beckoned him from beyond, the quiet charm of a small rural town he had discovered during his search for a new beginning. The town of Maplewood gleamed like a hidden gem. It was nestled among rolling hills, where nature enveloped the landscape in shades of green, gold, and shimmering azure. The warmth of the community captivated him. People greeted one another by name, the smell of fresh bread wafted from a corner bakery. Children played freely without the threat of judgment or rules suffocating their spirit. Carl rented a quaint cottage on the edge of town, surrounded by trees with leaves rustling in the gentle breeze, a calming symphony that washed over him with tranquility. As he settled in, he felt the tight grip of anxiety release, making room for hope to flourish. He decorated the cottage with the remnants of his past, pictures of his family, mementos from his journey, while allowing moments of laughter and creativity to seep back into his life. Days turned into weeks as Carl immersed himself in the rhythms of Maplewood. He found a local community garden where residents exchanged seeds, stories, and recipes. Inspired, he planted his own flowers, vibrant colors dancing in the patches of soil, no longer stifled by the fear of judgment. People from all walks of life became his neighbors, quickly becoming friends. They shared bonfires, potluck dinners, and evenings filled with music, laughter, and collective storytelling. For the first time in years, Carl felt the kindness of genuine connection. He found the peace he had been searching for, grounded in a community that valued not only home ownership but individuality. The wounds of his past remained present, but they no longer defined him. In the laughter of new friends, in the tender care of simple moments, he discovered a new definition of home. One crisp autumn evening, Carl stood in his garden as the sun dipped low, transforming the sky into a canvas of pink and orange hues. As he planted a cluster of daisies, a child from the community giggled nearby, running barefoot through the leaves. Carl felt a smile creep across his face, a sense of belonging lifting his spirits. He was no longer just a man with a painful history. He was someone rediscovering life, a catalyst to build, connect, and contribute to a community that thrived on authenticity and compassion. Over time, Carl embraced opportunities to engage further, joining local committees that sought to preserve the town's natural beauty, teaching youth gardening workshops, and learning to bake bread from the old woman who owned the bakery. Each experience entwined his existence more deeply with the lives around him, allowing him to shed the remnants of conflict and embrace a new identity. The seasons continued to change, weaving a tapestry of life that Carl could revel in. Golden fields swayed with the wind, winter whispered soft blankets of snow, and spring burst forth in a riot of colors. In Maplewood, Carl discovered more than just a place. He found a sanctuary and a family woven from shared stories and laughter, a place to nurture not only flowers but the spirit of individuality that thrived in the soil of community. Reflecting on his journey from the depths of despair to the heights of a newfound freedom, Carl understood the immense power of resilience. Though battles were fought and scars remained, they had shaped him into a person capable of embracing life's complexities. In his heart, he carried the memories of the past but had learned to encase them in gratitude. In a town that treasured authenticity and the vibrancy of its people, Carl had cultivated more than a garden. He had cultivated a life where he could truly call home, a reflection of who he was and who he aspired to become. As he savored the taste of freedom and connection, Carl knew he was ready to bloom anew, rooted deeply in the rich, fertile soil of Maplewood, free to explore the boundless horizon of possibilities that lay ahead.